So the story of Anselm himself is that he was born in northern Italy, in an alpine region of Italy. He began his life, his religious life, by entering a monastery and was aspiring to have a quiet monastic life, but soon found himself called to positions of leadership. He was talented as a scholar, as a pastor, as a speaker, as a writer, and he applied all of these gifts to the service of the church. The Glories of Heaven is a very good place to start with St. Anselm. It is very encouraging, uplifting.
I think the reason that it's a great primer for anybody in the spiritual life is because it starts with the end in mind. Like the stuff that it says in this little book is why Aquinas wrote the Summa Theologica. It's why all the apostles, except for John, got martyred and John got dipped in boiling oil. You know, it's why we do what we do.
Oh, my friend, flee for a while from your occupations. Cast aside your burdens and cares and put off your laborious duties. Rest in God and take your ease in Him. Shut out everything except for God and whatever helps you to find Him. Say now, my heart, say to God, Thy face, O Lord, do I seek.
Welcome, TAN fans and Father Robert Nixon, fresh in from Australia. Thank you for being here, Father.
Thank you, Conor. It's an honor and a privilege.
We're going to be talking about the great Saint Anselm of Canterbury and how we can learn from him today to be holier people ourselves. Yeah. So he's a great saint, but I'll ask you to begin us with a prayer invoking his intercession.
Almighty God, may the fervor, the wisdom, and the charity of Saint Anselm be with us today as we explore the wisdom which he has to offer us, this great spiritual director for modern readers. We thank you for the insights into your own divine truth and splendor, which you have offered through his hand. We ask this through Christ our Lord. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Father. And Anselm, boy, I was first exposed to him in college when I was studying philosophy at Steubenville, Franciscan University of Steubenville. And anybody in the Catholic world that goes to philosophy or theology school is at some point sort of tortured with the ontological argument. But we'll get to that.
That's right.
We'll get to that. But that was the first thing I remember about him, is that argument. Yeah. And then another work on why God became man, which really blew my mind. We'll get to that too. But the other night, I attended an amazing presentation and concert that you gave at Belmont Abbey College. And just so our listeners know, Father Nixon is not just a great translator of these lost spiritual classics and Latinist and spiritual director, retreat master, but also just an incredible pianist. And so you gave this incredible, I don't even know what you call it, presentation, event where you kind of gave a history of many of the great Benedictine saints, and you interspersed it with a concert playing the piano, some of which you wrote yourself. It was just absolutely beautiful, and everyone there thought it was one of the most enjoyable events they've ever been to. I've been to a lot of talks, Father, a lot of academic presentations. I've been to plenty of concerts. But what I experienced the other night at Belmont Abbey was one of the best events I've ever been to. It was remarkable. But in that, you did get to talk a little bit about Anselm. What struck me, Father, was how you were able to talk about Anselm and others kind of in the line of great Benedictine saints. They're not just in isolation. They're not in a vacuum. There's a great story of the Benedictine order, which we can't do in its entirety today. But talk to us about who Anselm is, where did he come from, what time he came in, but paint us a little bit of context for where he falls in the line of the Benedictine tradition.
Yeah, so when we look at the Benedictine tradition, we find more or less a continuum of saints who've been great writers, scholars, church leaders, beginning with Benedict himself. Then just a few years later, Gregory the Great. Gregory the Great sent St. Augustine of Canterbury over to England to convert the English. He actually wanted to go himself, but he couldn't because...
Not Augustine of Hippo.
This is, not Augustine of Hippo, Augustine of Canterbury.
Right.
And he went to England. There was Christianity there in a form already, but he brought them into union with the Roman Catholic Church. Mm. And he was then followed very shortly afterwards by people like Bede, Alcuin, and the English Benedictine Church continued so strongly. At a certain point in time, not long after this, England was invaded by the French, by the Normans.
Oh, yeah.
And it was around this time, in fact, it was at the invitation of William the Conqueror.
That
Anselm came over as Bishop of Canterbury. Yeah, so the story of Anselm himself is that he was born in northern Italy, in an alpine region of Italy, to noble parents, and showed great intelligence and esteem. When he was a young man, though, he got kind of distracted by worldly vanities, by wine and women, and I suppose the usual type of things. But then he had this great conversion experience, and he went off to join a monastery in France, Bec Abbey. And at the stage, the abbot of Bec Abbey was a person called Lanfranc, who is a blessed, who has been beatified, and he was regarded as the greatest living scholar of his time. So Anselm became his student and studied with him for a number of years, and in due course he became the abbot of this Bec Abbey. And from there, William the Conqueror, after he shifted over to England and basically took over, he invited Anselm to come and to serve as Archbishop of Canterbury.
So he was an Italian, right? Is that right?
Northern Italian.
And then he ends up in France.
And then went to France and then went to England. And I've often wondered, what language exactly did he speak? The answer is he would have spoken Latin, because that was basically the widespread universal language of the church at that time. Now, of course, the Italian language and the French language was still in their formative stage. So it probably would have been a bit of a mixture of Italian, French, and of course in England at that time, French was a commonly used language.
Yeah.
So a person who would have been skilled in multiple languages, but certainly traveled to different parts of Europe and conversed with people, gave wonderful conferences and so forth, without any apparent linguistic barrier at all. Now, after he went to England and became the Archbishop of Canterbury, he in a little while he fell out with the king, and it seems like this was William the one who followed William the Conqueror. And so he had to go over to Rome to visit the Pope, to try to reestablish the freedom of the church there. And so this was a very ongoing thing in his life, his working for the freedom of the English church. And I think it's still something which is quite an important issue, the freedom of the church from secular influence. And during this time, despite the busyness of his life, he was very occupied as a teacher of monks and clergymen and a spiritual director. And as a consequence, he wrote a large corpus of works, which are very outstanding. His best-known works today are a work called the Monologian, a work called the Proslogian, which contains the famous Ontological Argument, which you mentioned before, Conor, and there's a few other theological classics, Cur Deus Homo, Why God Became Man. But he also wrote a great number of devotional works, a collection of prayers, meditations, a work which is a collection of hymns to the Blessed Virgin Mary, homilies, letters, and so forth.
See, I'm always interested in these great theologians who do devotional works. It's very fitting for Tan. I mean, Tan is not the publisher of great theologians. That's not the idea of it. It does publish a lot of, great theologians, but it's supposed to be more devotional works. So when I hear, I didn't know, I knew St. Anselm wrote these great theological works, but you come around and now you start translating these things, and I find these spiritual writings of his. And I don't know why it is, but history seems to sometimes give preference to these theological works, and the devotional works kind of get swept by the wayside. And I prefer them. I think they're amazing. And so the ones we're going to talk about, they're just incredible. And so he was even more so, I think, a spiritual writer than a theologian, but we know him as a theologian.
We do. And for those few particular works which are very important, he's sometimes called a proto-scholastic, or the first scholastic. And he, as a doctor of the church, he's known as the Doctor Magnificus, the magnificent doctor, which I think is very fitting for him. He writes in his philosophical and theological works with a kind of outstanding clarity, which makes them very easy to understand. Sometimes I think the English translations are actually harder to understand than the Latin original.
Really?
It's kind of exemplary as a theologian and as a teacher of theology. And so these works, the Proslogian, the Monologian, they are theology, but in a way they're kind of reflections as well. So he doesn't make a sharp distinction between pure theology and philosophy and the devotional life. I think this is so important for Catholics involved in theology, not to let it become too dry, not to take the heart out of it.
Should we play around with the ontological argument?
Yeah,
See if we can explain it?
I think we should, because it's good to know at least what it is.
Yeah,
And,
go ahead, let her rip.
Okay. So his argument is that God is the thing which you can imagine nothing greater than. Now, sorry for finishing the sentence there with the preposition, but so God is basically the best possible thing that you could think of. He has the characteristics of goodness to the highest possible degree, to an infinite possible degree. And he says, okay, so what would you, when he comes to the question of existence, he says, is a thing which exists better than a thing which doesn't exist? He says, yes, of course, a thing which exists is better than a thing which doesn't exist. Now, because God is the best possible, it follows that he must exist, because it's better to have an existent thing than something not to exist. And you gave a very good example of that before, Conor, in our conversation, when you said, would you rather have $10 which exist or $1 million which don't actually exist? Of course, an existent thing. So if God is the perfection of all possible characteristics, of all possible attributes, it follows that God must have the attribute of existence.
Yeah. I love it. I remember trying to learn this thing and how I somehow committed it to memory. The version I heard is that than which nothing greater can be conceived necessarily exists, which is just a bizarre way of talking. Like we don't talk that way. But it once you sit with it for a while, you start to see it and you say, oh, okay, well, if I'm trying to imagine the greatest possible thing, I actually have to be thinking about something that exists, because existence is better than imagination. Yeah,
that's true. And of course, there was there was a response to this written by someone, probably written by Anselm himself.
I remember this,
but it gives the example of someone who thinks, okay, I'm going to think of the greatest possible island. And he imagines all these things on this island. And he says, oh, also the island must exist because it's the greatest possible island. And Anselm then refutes that objection. Now, it's very complicated, very philosophical. People will ask the question, is existence an attribute? And it's something to reflect upon. Personally, I find the argument to be convincing. You know? But all of our arguments for the existence of God ultimately come from the position of faith, which is a grace in itself.
Now, just so our listeners understand, the reason it's called ontological.
Ontological.
Why don't you explain ontos?
So basically, this is a Greek word which means being or existence. So ons or ens. So our word entity, for example, comes from that, something which exists. So ontology is the study of existence. I don't know if there are any professional ontologists in existence, people who actually make a living studying existence as such, but ontological means pertaining to existence.
And so when you were ordained, you
experienced an ontological change.
Exactly.
A change in my in the fundamental nature of my existence. Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, I think some of the complaints or the arguments about this particular argument for the existence of God is some people say, well, is it a proof that God actually exists, or is it just a proof that you need to believe he exists?
Yeah.
And it's very subtle, but I too find the argument convincing. There's other great arguments. Aquinas has 5, I think, proofs for the existence of God. But this is a beautiful one. And if I recall, and I'm going way back in my memory, but Anselm was a very pious, a very meditative, contemplative man. And if I recall, this came to him in prayer.
Yeah.
This argument came. It didn't come from him working out syllogisms on paper.
It did. And I've included a wonderful quote from that very work, the Proslogion, at the beginning of the Glories of Heaven. And this is how he begins that work. "Oh, my friend, flee for a while from your occupations. Hide yourself from the tumult of your thoughts. Cast aside your burdensome cares and put off your laborious duties. Rest in God and take your ease in him. Shut out everything except for God and whatever helps you to find him. Close the door firmly and seek him. Say now, my heart, say to God, I seek thy face. Thy face, O Lord, do I seek."
It's beautiful.
So it's the beginning of the Proslogion. So it actually is
spiritual work.
It is a devotional work.
Yeah, right. Yeah, that's great. Now let's shift to again, I haven't looked at this in 25 years, I guess, but the why God became man. If I recall, that art. The one thing I remember from that is he says he's grappling with the question: would the incarnation have happened? Would the second person of the Trinity taken on a human nature if man had never fallen? Because we often think that God became flesh to save us. Well, that's true, but would he have come if we hadn't fallen?
Yeah.
And I found this to be a completely beautiful, very inspired answer that he gave. And Father, there's probably a dozen main things I learned in college or grad school that have really shaped my thinking going forward. And this is one of them. It was the idea that God becoming man, the incarnation, was so glorious that the reality of that is actually greater a reality. It's a greater glory than our salvation, because we're kind of minuscule compared to God. So Anselm is saying that he would have still become man simply for the glory of uniting humanity with God, which is an even greater thing than the salvation of man from the pains of hell.
Indeed. So the idea, and this is something which theologians have spoken about over many generations, about whether the fall and the redemption was actually part of God's original plan. And the incarnation, of course. And the incarnation should be understood as like this wonderful overflowing of the love and glory of God. So it serves as a revelation of God's glory. So the idea of Christ coming wasn't just to repair what humankind had lost, but to do something much more wonderful than that. And if we think about it, the joys of heaven, with the infinite glories of heaven, are going to so much exceed the limited joys which mankind had in the Garden of Eden. Yeah. So it's not simply a matter of restoration, but an overflowing of God's grace and glory.
Yeah, absolutely. I often think I'd love to ask Anselm, who was a brilliant but also saintly man. I'd love to ask him, this is very anthropomorphic, I guess, but what I've often wondered, what was the dialogue like in the Holy Trinity? They're sitting up there in heaven, and Father, Son, Holy Spirit sitting around saying, "Hey," and someone said, "I got an idea. Let's become man." And then this. Is there any volunteers? Father, Son, Holy Spirit. I am. I'm sure it was far more sophisticated than that. But I find that incredible because I have reflected on this. I've written a little bit on it, Father, and see if this makes sense to you. The idea of the incarnation is almost crazy. Like it's so I got chickens outside my chicken coop. Imagine one morning I wake up and tell my wife, I've decided to become a chicken because I love my chickens. I've decided to become an ant because I love the ants crawling around the ground. I mean, that's God saying I've decided to become man is even more outrageous, And it's a form of love that I just can't comprehend. Why in the world would he do this? So I grapple with that. In fact, it's such an outrageous idea that it could only be divine. Like you and I couldn't really come up with that. You and I couldn't really come up with this. It's the idea of the incarnation in my mind is only a divine idea because it takes an infinite amount of love to even come up with this notion.
It is. And, that's very right. It's something which is a great, awesome mystery. And it's for this reason that we bow our heads every time the incarnation is mentioned in the creed or whatever. We don't bow our heads at the mention of the crucifixion or death. And this supreme mystery, and I think Anselm grappled with it so powerfully. And this is something which is beyond the comprehension of any theologian. But at the same time, all these different reflections on its necessity, on its meaning and on its mystery, I think are wonderful, very enriching to read.
And I think the people that have the most insight to these realities are not just the scholastic theologians, but they're the holy prayer warriors like Anselm was, who combine the heart and the mind together and come up with insight. Now, on that note, why don't you walk us through his other works? So we've mentioned his theological works, but talk to us a little bit about the books you've done for us and anything else that comes to mind.
Yes. Well, amongst his devotional works, one in particular is the Glories of Heaven, which was originally a series of conferences he gave to the monks at the great French monastery of Cluny. So he would travel back and forth from England and around the continent very frequently. And he had this monk, Eanmar, who was like his scribe and student, who carefully copied down this conference. So it's wonderful to hear him speaking to a group of young monks about the joys of heaven. And the other work, which I've translated for Tan, is his dialogue with the Blessed Virgin Mary. And this arose as the consequence of him spending a few days in serious prayer and fasting and vigils. And he has this vision of the Blessed Virgin Mary and speaks to her about the passion of her son. So it's a very moving work.
Are there other works that you might be translating in the future? Or?
Yeah, there are a few other works. He wrote something on the Immaculate Conception, which is a wonderful work, and a number of other things as well.
The Immaculate Conception, wasn't that something that was really pretty debated at the time? I mean, we didn't have real clarity on that until the Middle Ages.
It hadn't been defined as a doctrine at that time. I mean, it was still a very common belief, and I think there was the feast of the Immaculate Conception, especially in England, interestingly enough, was a broadly celebrated feast there. But it was only later, and actually only in relative recent times, that it's been defined as a dogma of the Church.
How would you say his life ended up? So he had some exile, with his conflict with the king, I guess. But I mean, how did he end up? Do you know anything about his death? How did it all end for him?
Yeah. So he died at a fairly advanced age. He was born in 1033 and died in 1109. Mm-hmm. And his death was a typical monastic death. He was surrounded by his monks, by his monastic.
It's a nice way to go.
It was a very peaceful death. Yeah.
What's his? We've sort of talked about it, but how would you say, particularly as a Benedictine monk yourself, what's his legacy within the Benedictine order? Are there other saints that you think of that built on his work or were heavily influenced? What would you just say kind of his legacy within the order is?
Well, his legacy is as a great theologian and writer, and also as an example of what happens to a lot of Benedictine monks. They enter a monastery seeking a life of contemplation and solitude, but then often find themselves called upon to occupy positions of leadership in the church and to negotiate business and so forth. And this was something which happened very much to St. Anselm of Canterbury, happened very much to Bernard of
I was
Clairvaux.
about to say Bernard. It happened to him over and over again, and he was about the same time.
He was, yeah, very shortly afterwards.
I'm curious if they ever bumped into each other. I don't know. I don't know if they ever met.
That's an interesting point.
Yeah, I don't know.
See, Anselm, Bernard would have been about 20, I suppose, when Anselm passed away. So it's probably pretty unlikely.
A little younger. Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, his influence is unmistakable. My experience, in the church is that we don't recognize him enough as a spiritual master. We recognize him as a theologian, and I hope my hope in these podcasts and in these works that Tan can really promote the idea of we need to be seeking his intercession in our lives, and we need to be modeling. He's a model for us. We need to be emulating his daily life and the way he lived. So doctors of the church are often thought of as just these smart guys. And it's so much. And he is a doctor. We forget that, right? I mean, there's only 37, I think, at the moment.
That's about right, yeah.
So, I mean, he's a doctor of the church. And you don't get that just by being smart. You get it by being smart and holy,
Indeed.
Hey guys, real quick, we noticed 80% of you that watch the episodes are not subscribed. So please do me the favor and subscribe and hit the bell for notification. That helps you get the content, but it also helps this amazing stuff get spread to other people just like you. Thanks for your help. Now let's dive back in. We're going to turn to my favorite of his works, The Passion of Christ through the eyes of Mary. It's a fabulous work. By the way, it's beautifully designed. I'm very proud of that. But I get these manuscripts and I start flipping through it, and there's always a surprise in there. There's always a surprise, and it's one of the surprises in this volume is that it's actually, I guess, 3 different works put together. So we have something definitely from St. Anselm, and then something potentially from Bernard of Clairvaux. And then we have something called Our Lady's Lament. So why don't you just walk us through the structure of the book and where these different works come from?
So these 3 works are all works from the middle or late medieval period. They're all contemplating the passion of our Lord Jesus Christ through the perspective of Mary. And this was something which became a practice about the time at which St. Anselm and St. Bernard lived. During that stage, there was an increased attention on the human sufferings of Christ. Not that it had been something which had been forgotten, but I guess had been emphasized a little bit less in the past, when there was more emphasis on portraying Christ purely as a heroic or triumphant figure. So various things caused people's hearts to be touched by this reawakened sense of Christ's human suffering and the great mystery of the Incarnation. And of course, the Blessed Virgin Mary is such an important figure, both as one who shared closely in the passion of Christ, in his pain, in his agony, and one who participated by her consent, by her maternity in the saving mystery of the Incarnation. So this work compiles 3 pieces. The first of which is written by St. Anselm of Canterbury. It takes the form of a dialogue between St. Anselm and the Blessed Virgin Mary. And in this dialogue, he asks her about the Passion of Christ and her experiences and her witnessing of it. And she relates to him. The second work, attributed to St. Bernard, but scholars are not really sure if he actually wrote it or not. It begins as a dialogue between St. Bernard and the Blessed Virgin Mary, and then continues as a narrative.
Which doesn't really bother me. I mean, whether it's actually him or not. Would you say that with your experience with his certain works that it's in keeping with his
very
style?
much in keeping with his style, his spirituality, his focus upon the humanity of Christ. And the thing is, of course, Bernardus was a very common name for monks back in those days. So whether it was by Bernard of Clairvaux or another Bernard, no one can be absolutely certain.
We should spend some time at some other point in the future on Bernard of Clairvaux. He's becoming quickly, he's going up higher and higher on my list of favorite saints. We publish a biography on him. And I think it's safe to say, we're not here to talk about him, but I'll just mention this in passing because I think it's awesome. he is probably the most influential man in his time period that was ever.
Indeed.
You know, his influence on kings. He settled a dispute among who the real pope was.
Yeah.
And he was just this frail, quiet, soft-spoken monk. But kings and popes bowed before him. It's unbelievable.
They did. Quite a phenomenal figure, and would be frequently summoned from his monastery to do things, you know, to settle wars, to settle, rivalries between different kings and rulers, and even on one occasion, as you mentioned, to decide who was really the legitimate pope.
Didn't he start the first crusade?
He started, was it the first crusade? I'm not sure which crusade, but he did definitely start a crusade.
Yeah. That's not on my resume.
No. Well,
he's got an awesome resume.
He does indeed. And, you know, in retrospect, looking at the bloodshed and devastation which resulted from those crusades, some people would say, was it the right thing? But he certainly did it.
Live and learn.
He did it with the spirit of that it was the right thing to do for the Christian faith at the time.
Yeah.
Yeah, so a wonderful saint. And, of course, very important within the history of the Benedictine order.
Yeah.
So he was one of the earliest Cistercian monks. And the Cistercians are kind of Benedictine. Yeah. They're reformed Benedictines. They were trying to be more faithful to the original model of the rule by incorporating manual labor into the daily life of monks and by a higher degree of asceticism at the time.
Yeah.
I would say that at this point in time, though, the mainstream Benedictines and the Cistercians we're very close, and we're all part of the same one Benedictine family.
Yeah. So, and I could talk about Bernard forever, but we got to move on. And so that's kind of the second part of this book.
Part.
And then the third part is Our Lady's Lament.
Is Our Lady's Lament, which was written by another Benedictine monk, John Lydgate, who was an English Benedictine. He was living in the 1300s. It was written originally, unlike the other two, which were both written originally in Latin, in Middle English. So this was a different experience of translating a Middle English text into kind of contemporary English.
And so in the back here, there are very short meditations for every bead on the rosary.
There are. So I've included at the end what is called the Rosary of the Seven Sorrows of Mary, sometimes called the Servite Rosary. So this rosary consists of 7 sets of 7 Hail Marys with 7 Our Fathers accompanying each one. And this includes meditation for every one of those Hail Marys, and also a listing of the various the indulgences granted to people who use this rosary by various popes.
I mean, this little book that we now publish with you, this is like the Swiss Army knife of Mary's Passion. I mean, it has a little bit of everything about the Passion of Mary, you know, as she accompanied Christ's Passion. So it is.
The sorrows of Mary and the Passion of Christ are so wonderfully presented here. And these works, amazingly as it might seem, have not been available in modern editions until now.
Yeah, it's the first time. This is what Tan Resurrection is doing, is resurrecting these things that have been lost to history. Yeah. You know, you're like, Father Robert Nixon is like, I guess, the Indiana Jones of great lost Catholic works. You know, you are saving these things, and we're doing the easy part, which is just publishing them. But so we're going to jump in now to the text, and I think our listeners will hear exactly why this is such an amazing work. So it begins with the betrayal of Christ and his prayer in the Garden of Gethsemane. And this is like a dialogue, it says Anselm and then Mary and Anselm and Mary, and they're talking back and forth, right? Yeah. But on the first page, I read something that blows my mind. Actually, I first read this, I was at Mass, and it was just like 3 minutes before Mass started, and it kind of distracted me the entire rest of the Mass. It was an amazing little historical thing that, whether it's true, doesn't really matter, because it's just a beautiful metaphor. And it says this: Mary says that the denarii, the silver, the 30 pieces of silver that they used to pay Judas when he betrayed Christ in the garden, were the same 30 pieces of silver that the Old Testament Joseph, his older brothers, received when they sold him into slavery. And And you have a footnote there about it, but why don't you tell us about how that 30 pieces of silver by legend, stayed in the treasury and made it all the way down to Judas?
Yeah. So the story is that when Joseph's brothers sold him into slavery, they received these 30 silver denarii, and they were then preserved in the temple. Both as a historical point of thing and because that they were, there was something slightly sinister about these particular silver denarii, which supposedly were 10 times the weight and value of a regular denarius. And these were the same ones which they offered Judas for this act of betrayal.
Oh man,
yeah. And I
such
think
a powerful image.
Whether that's true or not, it as you mentioned, it's not so important. It's part of a private revelation, so it's a kind of devotional thing. But I think there is, it's remarkable to think that happens, and it puts into perspective also Judas' betrayal.
Yeah,
like we think. The way that it's written about here is it was because he was actually filled with avarice, that he actually wanted these. And otherwise we might think, well, 30 pieces of silver doesn't sound like very much. But when you think about these were pieces of silver which were 10 times the usual size.
Yeah, so 300 pieces of silver,
indeed.
Or whatever. Yeah, it's a powerful image. And in chapter 2, on page 8, it talks about the arrest of Christ, and I found this fascinating. So we often hear a reference to the brethren of Jesus, talking about James and John. And I guess we understand. I guess most of us understand that the word for brethren is the same as cousin.
Yep.
And our church teaches, of course, that Mary didn't have any other children. But here it says, now there were, and this is Mary speaking, now there were two amongst those in the garden who were of very similar appearance, namely James and Jesus.
That's right.
For this reason, Judas said to the guards that the one that I kissed.
Well, that's right. And, people who hear the story of the Passion, often I've wondered myself, why did Judas need to just, didn't they know who Jesus was? Yeah. Surely they would have known because he was, a public figure. But this kind of explains it.
Yeah, it does.
That Jesus and James were of almost identical appearance. It also makes a lot of sense of the reason why he was called the brother of Jesus, the twin of Jesus.
Yeah.
So, so that puts into context the significance of this kiss, why the kiss was needed to betray, to identify which one was really Jesus, that the Roman soldiers wouldn't have been able to distinguish the two.
I love it. So as we go on, there's multiple places here where, we're seeing something, Father, that's not in the Gospels, right? Yeah. And readers love this kind of thing. We have a very popular TV series out there now called The Chosen. And it's about the apostles, but it's kind of the scenes. It's about the apostles and Christ, but it's the scenes between the gospel readings, And so people enjoy kind of the creative license to say, okay, what might have been happening with Peter, in between the lines of the Gospels.
Indeed.
And I kind of feel like this book does that. But it's from a saint.
It does. It's from a saint, and as I mentioned before, this is private revelation to Saint Anselm. But a lot of these things also were common beliefs or legends in circulation during the Middle Ages. I think one of the great tragedies in the church scholarship in modern times is there's almost a deliberate attempt on the part of some scholars and translators to write out these kind of details. To think, well, this is not in Scripture, so we should leave it out. One of the problems with the modern breviary is it leaves out the lives of the saints. Saying that some of them are unhistorical or unproven. Yeah. But I mean, this is what gives color and substance. So I love bringing this kind of stuff to modern readers.
I do too. And so, all right. So on page 14, there's a great scene here where they are hearing. Okay, it's talking about Mary Magdalene. Mary's telling Anselm. Mary Magdalene, meanwhile, was standing to and fro restlessly, wandering to and fro restlessly, seeking to see or hear what was taking place and striving to gain some knowledge of what was happening inside through the window. So this is a scene, sorry, I should have said, this is where Jesus is he before who is he standing before? Before the high priest.
Yeah, he's before the high priest.
The high priest. And she, perchance, she happened to hear Peter's denials of Christ. How great was the sorrow and anxiety which pierced her heart when she heard those dreadful words whereby the man who had been chosen as the leader of the disciple abandoned his beloved master. And then Mary says that she heard it herself. Like so she made eye contact with Peter. And you have this scene where Peter, who was chosen to lead all the apostles, these women heard his denial.
They did.
And then he just runs.
They did. So, often one of the things which I often wondered about until I translated this is what was Mary doing while Jesus was being questioned? And the other disciples and Mary Magdalene. And it seems that they were all in close proximity. They were all, trying to hear and see what was going on. And of course they did, because how else would we know what happened, what transpired? And so it's recorded here in detail, and Mary Magdalene's reaction, how she, when she hears these denials, that she announces that she will never deny. And similarly with Mary, the mother of Jesus, and her great anguish, her anxiety, and her son is being here interrogated, is in custody, and she's doing her best to hear and see what's going on from the outside.
Now tell us, when Peter runs off, he goes somewhere. Tell us about that. This is cool. This is very cool.
So, we read only in the gospel that he hears the cock crow and then he goes and weeps bitterly. This gives us an extra detail. He goes and conceals himself in this rock and remains there until after the resurrection. The name of this rock is Gallicantus, which means in Latin the crow of a cock, of a rooster. And interestingly enough, there is actually this rock, this Gallicantus rock, still in existence, and there's a little monastery there. And I never realized that's what the tradition is, that was the rock where Peter hid himself until after the resurrection.
Wow. Yeah, that's very cool. It's very cool. Now, the next chapter, Christ is led to Caiaphas, and here Anselm asks Mary an interesting question. In fact, he asks her multiple times through this. He says, "Did you have any hope, Mary, that Jesus might be liberated from his plight?" He's like, "Did you think at this point that he might get out of this mess?" Yeah. It's a very human, normal question to ask.
It is.
And she answers a couple different times. She definitely did. She was hopeful that Jesus would get out of this. And she says, "For I knew that he was eloquent in speech and extremely intelligent. I therefore certainly hoped that he could defend himself convincingly against any judge. But when he came before his judge, he stood like a gentle lamb before his slaughter, not opening his mouth." I think it's a very endearing thing where this mother is saying, my son, not just that he's God, he could snap his finger and solve this, but he's going to talk his way out of this because he can. But he doesn't. And she has to witness him being that sacrificial lamb. And it must have been registering with her, oh, he really is the Lamb of God.
Yeah. So, of course, Mary understood that Jesus was destined to suffer for the salvation of the world, but she didn't know the precise occasion when this was going to happen or how it was going to happen or anything. So, of course, she was still very hopeful that he was going to be liberated. And as you mentioned, she knew that he was such a powerful, eloquent, intelligent speaker. She felt that he'll speak to he'll speak and he'll defend himself. Indeed, as he had in the past on several other occasions. He was evidently very convincing. And I think when we think about Christ, this is something we can overlook. He was really the most effective public speaker of all time. He spoke to these enormous crowds without the benefit of a microphone, and converted people just with a few words. He didn't always need the miracles to do it. No.
But that's a good segue, the need for miracles to convert people. In chapter 6, Jesus is brought before Herod, then returned to Pilate. So I'm on page 23. This is interesting. This is where I love this private revelation stuff and the history and the tradition, because we find things that I certainly had never thought about, never heard about. And so it says here that Herod implored him to give some display of his marvelous power. So again, this is so cool. Actually, let me go back. There's this interesting point where Herod asks Mary, again, Mary's telling Anselm this, right? And Herod asks Jesus, "Are you the one that my father tried to kill when you were a baby?"
Yeah.
How interesting a question. I mean, it makes perfect sense that he would have asked him that.
Well, that's right. And the story about this prophecy of this king who was to emerge, and Herod Senior had slaughtered the innocents as a result of that. But certainly the prophecy was still in existence, and something which Herod, the Herod who lived at the time of the Passion, was aware of. It makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
And so wondering if this emerging leader is the one who has been foretold. And we see the attitude of Herod here as one of great curiosity. You know, he really wants to see a miracle, to see if this guy who's got such an immense reputation, to see if he's for real, to witness it for himself.
So in trying to entice Jesus
Yeah.
to do a miracle, he crowns him. Herod even placed a crown upon his head, earnestly pledging to make him a share of his royal power and equal co-heir to the throne, if only he would perform a miracle for him. That's an amazing thing, and you can't read that and not think about his temptation by Satan in the desert.
It is. And I think Herod in this case is thinking, here is the emerging king. Here is the one who has been foretold to be the king of Israel.
Which he would know about. I mean, he's got to be educated in the prophecies.
Indeed. And he has an immense number of followers. So I think Herod is thinking, if I can make this person a co-ruler with myself, I can protect my own position.
Oh, that's awesome. You see, that's a really cool insight, because it's not so much that Herod's looking for the king to follow. He's probably trying to protect his own, his own reputation by kind of, he wants to use Christ's reputation as to protect himself.
And this is something which happened on a few occasions in the Roman Empire where there'd be a rival, and so there would be an appointed co-emperor.
Yeah.
So the idea was to make Jesus a partner in his own rule.
And Jesus is just like not having anything to do with this.
No.
He's like, I'm not playing this game.
That you don't understand it completely, that he's, his kingdom is not of this world.
So it don't work, right? No. And Herod's pissed off about this.
He is.
And so then Mary explains to Anselm on the next page. He says, "And on that very day, Herod and Pilate, who had hitherto been enemies, became firm friends." I mean, it's the story. It's the story of what happens in feuds. Oh, yes. And so Herod and Pilate now, hey, they're buddy from here on out.
Well, that's right. And one thing she mentions is that Herod also hoped to spare him after this interview. That he had, this kind of sense that this is someone whose great dignity, worth and everything, that he doesn't want to condemn him. And so for this reason, sends him to Pilate as his kind of own way of washing his hands of the matter.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. So they were both kind of washing their hands of it. They both had a sense, I don't think we should kill this guy.
Yeah. But
they also lacked the...
They lack the moral fortitude to stand up to the crowd.
Yeah, exactly. All right, so it's just incredible. I'm just kind of flipping through here. Another sentence that really struck me, Father, on chapter 7. We've moved on to the scourging and crowning with thorns. And, Mary is quite descriptive here, and she's explaining on page 27 how, Jesus was such a good-looking man. He was so attractive to people. But after the scourging and after the crowning of thorns, she says, he looked as if he was horribly deformed and stupefied, like one consumed by leprosy. Like his skin had been so destroyed that he looked like he had leprosy. It's just a description I've never heard before.
Yeah. And you can imagine how shocking that would have been for any mother to see their beloved son in such a state. Yeah,
absolutely. So on chapter 10, the crucifixion, page 35, Mary says, "Here, Anselm, I shall tell you what I have to relate is profoundly lamentable and of infinite bitterness, and none of the evangelists have recorded these dreadful things in the sacred pages of their holy books. So she's going to be telling us stuff that the evangelists...
Indeed. I mean, the Gospels each say that he was crucified. They don't give any details about how exactly what happened and what that involves.
And so, she gives a little bit interesting context. So Calvary, which we just think of as like a hill with a cross on it, a wretched and deplorable place where carcasses of dogs and the corpses of beggars and lepers are discarded. And they stripped my son of all his clothing, leaving him completely exposed. Now, this is an interesting point I wanted to mention. I have often thought that part of the horror of the crucifixion was the shame of being stripped down naked. I mean, why in the world would the Roman guards, allow a guy who they're crucifying to maintain some level of, modesty or whatever? So this is a beautiful notion to me, leaving him completely exposed. I myself, we're talking about Mary now saying this, I myself, as I looked on, felt barely alive, so weakened was I with horror and shock. Nevertheless, I took the veil which I wore on my head and wrapped it around his waist to provide him with some covering for the sake of modesty. Yeah. That's a beautiful notion. First of all, women shouldn't have been exposing their hair, so she was probably doing something that was risky anyway, for herself. But she took this veil off and wrapped it around his waist. It was a very motherly, a very tender thing to do for her son. It is.
Yeah. And, I think that makes sense too, because we always see Jesus crucified. He has that cloth around his loins. And, that's very ancient tradition. So I think that this is very unbelievable and understandable.
Yeah, it's beautiful. That chapter concludes with something this is interesting. She says that the cross was raised up. It was of such a height that I was not able to touch his feet. That's a very different picture than I've seen on TV.
We normally imagine it not being so tall, but that it was very, very high. And I think that makes sense, because it was designed to be very visible.
Very visible for everybody in town.
So it was like an enormous thing. And I think this is actually consistent with what we hear about the cross in St. Helena's discovery of it.
Oh,
It's great size.
Yeah, it was huge. Constantine's mother, who went to the Holy Land to find the cross.
Indeed.
So another interesting point here is she says when he was crucified, laying on the ground, they nailed him down. He didn't actually bleed a lot because the nails were so large that it just kind of filling the wounds. Yeah. But then when they raised it up and it went up, then his body, the gravity of his body, the weight of his body, boom, went down on the spikes. Yeah. And once he was raised up, because of the weight of his suspended body, all of his wounds burst open. Blood flowed forth in copious torrents from his hands and feet. At that time, this is a powerful image. I mean, I think it is, and I've never seen a movie depict this. She says, at the time, I was wearing a kind of white sheet, as was the custom for religious women, which covered my head and my entire body. And as I stood at the foot of the cross, this pure white garment became saturated with the streams of crimson blood, which gushed from his precious body.
Indeed.
Some powerful stuff right there, Yeah. So the book goes on. It briefly talks about the last words of Christ, which we're going to talk about at another point in Bonaventure, because you've done a translation on the original 7 last words of Christ by Saint Bonaventure. So that's a whole nother conversation. But she does touch on a few of those last words that Christ spoke from the cross. But I wanted to zoom in on one thing. On page 42, the very last line on that page, and we're going to talk about this some point when we talk about Bonaventure. This is powerful. She does mention that he said, "It is consummated." Now, we often hear in our translations, the NABRE translation and the RSV, "It is finished, it is ended."
Yeah.
But the Douay Rheims, which is Tan's, translation and my favorite translation, "It is consummated." So I just thought it was worth talking about how that particular translation, which is much more literal from the Latin Vulgate, then it is finished. And
Indeed.
Finished and consummated are two very different concepts.
It is.
So you use that translation. And so I just thought here just a minute or two on what this means to you. It is consummated.
So, consummated implies the fulfillment of this great mission, of this great work. And it also implies a union. We often use, I guess, the most common usage of the word consummated today is in relation to marriage.
You have to consummate your marriage.
That this kind of is not a finish, but a drawing to completion, which in a way is a glorious beginning. So I think, this translation, it is consummated. And, I hadn't realized, I always assumed that was the same translation as in the Douay Rheims, as in the King James Version, as in the Wycliffe version. But I checked out all these older versions as well, because there are lots of English translations which, far precede the King James and everything. Yeah. And it seems it's unique to the Douay Rheims, which I think is to its great credit.
It is. It's because St. Jerome, a doctor of the church, understood the significance of this word, and I think the other translators perhaps did not.
Yeah.
I mean, it's his word. I mean, he's choosing, well, it's the Latin Vulgate, I guess, but I mean, was the King James coming from the Latin Vulgate?
It was.
Okay.
But for some odd reason, the King
English
James
translators aren't
changed it to it is finished or it is done.
Yeah.
There are a few inexplicable things in the King James where they seem deliberately to change the meaning of the Latin words. Yeah.
It's interesting. It's such a much more complete word because it's the fulfillment of all the Old Testament prophecies, and it's the completion of Christ's relationship with the church.
Yeah.
So everything is good to go from here on. It's almost like not an ending, it's almost a beginning.
It is, it is, yeah. So it's a consummation of the glory of God's mission and the consummation of this mystical union between Christ and the church and between divine nature and human nature.
Yeah. I think Jerome was pretty clear that it was supposed to be consummation. I don't know why people mess with that. But nonetheless, one thing that I'll just mention here, this was a very cool scene on page 44. Mary says, after this, he bowed his head. So this is after he said it's consummated, he's died. And he says he bowed his head, gave up his spirit. Then the veil of the temple was torn in two from the top and the bottom. We know that. The earth shook and the stones were torn apart. This was particularly the case with the large boulder upon which the cross itself stood. It was rent apart in such a way as to leave an opening large enough to insert a hand into. So like the whole the ground just breaks. Tombs also opened up, and many of the bodies of the saints who rested within rose from the dead. Following the resurrection of my son, many of these saints went out from their tombs and entered the holy city, where they were seen by many. Oh, that is it is. That's a crazy scene.
It is. And in fact, the resurrection of the other dead from their tombs is something which is mentioned only very briefly in the Gospel of Matthew. But if you think about it, that's a completely amazing thing that it must have been really, I guess, something which anyone who was present at the time must have been overawed by these things which were going on. Not only the eclipse of the sun, these rocks splitting open, tombs opening up. Yeah.
So another beautiful thing that kind of goes through this book, and I didn't realize it until I got about halfway through, but I realized that at many occasions she refers to the prophecy of Simeon about the sword piercing her heart. Yeah. And it turns out she says it 7 times.
She does. And in fact, in each of these works, there's reference to that sword of sorrow, which Simeon had predicted. And in each time, it's 7. So the tradition of the 7 sorrows of Mary was one which obviously extends back to this time.
Another thing that I had never heard of, which I hope is true because it's just incredible. Page 52, Father. This is really the Pietà, like when the body of Christ is taken down from the cross. And it says, all the disciples came and mourned deeply over the death of their master, but then it came about that the body of my deceased son was miraculously restored. what immense consolation it brought to me and all his disciples. In this glorified body, there were no wounds or scars to be seen except for the 5 scars of the sacred wounds of his crucifixion. And these 5 wounds are destined to remain visible on his body until the final day of judgment. But apart from these, his body appeared entirely healthy, as if he had never undergone the ordeal of his passion.
Yeah, this is amazing, isn't it? And, you know, we're told that when Christ appears in his resurrected form, he still bears the wounds.
Yeah.
But to think all the other wounds, all the other injuries which he was suffered were miraculously healed. And I guess, you know, it was a divine body, so by its nature, it couldn't be in this wretched state after death. So, and she mentions how much consolation she gets from this fact that
she got a lot of consolation, but then they have to put him in the tomb. And she does, and she doesn't want to.
No. I mean, this is something which appears in all 3 narratives, that she really doesn't want him to be taken from her embrace.
Yeah.
They almost have to forcibly take him from her.
And John,
arms.
who's now the caregiver for her, you know, Mary says to Anselm, John knew I had to let go. John basically forced her to go back home. They had to pry his body out of her hands. Essentially, that's what happens. But isn't that what would happen with any mother? Like, you know, your kid dies in the hospital. You have to pry the mother away, you know, and so that we shouldn't be surprised that was the case, but it's a beautiful revelation that he had.
Very heartbreaking to think of what that was like for her.
So, you know, this book, remarkable. I could go on and on, but we kind of skimmed the surface of Anselm's revelations from the Blessed Mother. It gave me so much insight into the passion that I had never had before. I mean, I love this. And to our listeners, I mean, if you heard anything that was interesting, trust me, it's every paragraph is interesting. We're just skimming the surface. So, I mean, Father, any kind of last thoughts on your experience working on this, or any advice to our potential readers of what they can get out of this tremendous work for their own spiritual formation?
Yeah, you know, I really think this would be is a tremendous work for people to read who are wanting to meditate upon the passion of Christ, you know, and the Gospels are great for that, of course, but this provides so much more detail, so many heart-rending details, as we've just discussed a few of them, and there are many more which we haven't talked about. And what's more, this is not just anyone imagining these things. This is one of the great doctors and saints of the Church, St. Anselm of Canterbury, which he experienced in this wonderful vision. And, you know, it's such a privilege for me to bring this otherwise lost and neglected work to light. And it's a kind of work where there are references to it in other books. They say, oh, well, there's the, you know, St. Anselm's dialogue, but there's none of the actual details. So until now, it's been almost under a cloak of oblivion. So thanks to Conor, thanks to Tan Books, it's a privilege to be able to bring this to contemporary readers.
Tan Books is here to help you become a saint. That's why we do everything we do. We publish thousands of titles, literally, that are specifically written to help you get to heaven. Everything from the lives of the saints to the writings of the saints, the greatest doctors of the church, the great spiritual masters, Alphonsus Liguori, St. Francis de Sales, and so on. So please come to tanbooks.com and find the book that God wants you to have right now so that you can get to heaven and be a saint for eternity.
This short little work called The Glories of Heaven, the supernatural gifts that await body and soul in paradise. And this is fun because we often talk about what we need to do to get to heaven, but in here we talk about what it's going to be like to be in heaven. What brought you to this work? You have a lot of old volumes and a digital database of these old ancient saints' works. How'd you stumble across this one, and why'd you decide to translate it?
Well, interesting question, Conor, you know, and I was thinking to myself, how many books have I read about heaven? I thought, not a great number. And it's so important. It's the ultimate goal of the Christian life. And for Benedictine monks in particular, we're told that our heart should be filled with longing for heaven. And I happened upon this book, and, well, I thought, I read through it and found about its origins. that it was originally a conference which St. Anselm had given to a group of young monks at the monastery of Cluny. And I thought, wow, this is fantastic. It's so encouraging, so accessible that it was something which I just felt I had to share with contemporary readers.
Well, Cluny was a famous monastery, am I correct?
It was. So it had been founded about 100 years ago, before the time of St. Anselm, and was famous for its liturgy and scholarship, and at that stage was on continental Europe the biggest, most flourishing monastery there was. So St. Anselm was invited to visit there because he was a tremendous writer, spiritual leader whose reputation spread all the way throughout Christendom at the time. So he was asked to share a few encouraging words with the monks about what heaven was like, and the result was this wonderful series of conferences.
And to your knowledge, this is the first time this work has been in English.
Yes, indeed. This is the first time the work has appeared in English. So although St. Anselm is such a famous saint and a great doctor of the church, a number of his works haven't yet been translated into English.
That's incredible. I mean, it's a doctor of the church. There's only 37, and there's works untranslated.
That is. But there are a few works by Aquinas that haven't been translated yet. So,
I didn't know that.
Yeah. So
see, it's incredible.
It is. Well, I guess the imperative to translate things into English only came about in the last half century or so before.
Yeah. You've only had 50, 60 years of doing this,
Well,
So,
yeah.
So, I mean, I guess the imperative, So, I mean, but we got a lot of translations to do, So it's exciting, and I'm glad Tan can participate in that. So this book begins, The Glories of Heaven, by, how do you say his name? Eadmar, his introductory letter to another monk, saying what? Why don't you tell us what this introductory letter is?
So in this, he begins, I'll just read a little bit. You shall remember, I believe, that when our venerable father Anselm, the Archbishop of Canterbury, recently spent a few days at the monastery at Cluny, he took the opportunity to say a few words to the assembly of the brothers there. On that occasion, he said many wonderful things about the eternal happiness of the kingdom of heaven. And as you no doubt recall, requested that I should note down all that he said in the presence of the brothers at the time, and give you a copy for your perusal and edification. Yeah. And so the result is this work. So Eadmar, who also was the main biographer of St. Anselm, transcribed this conference and then wrote it down at the request of one of his friends who'd asked for it.
I got you. Okay, so you have this guy basically taking some kind of Latin shorthand, and then he probably went back and transcribed it like kind of all the way through.
They would have written it out by hand, yeah.
Yeah.
And he apologizes for sometimes where he thinks he might have fallen short of what Anselm actually said in the original. But yeah, I'm pretty sure it's an accurate transcription of all that was said in those conferences.
And that's awesome. So, Anselm has some introductory remarks. But the unique thing about this book is that it starts getting into, I guess you'd call them attributes of the body in heaven. And starts on page 11. He starts with beauty, the beauty of the bodies of the blessed. Now, one thing this reminded me of, and we publish another book called The Happiness of Heaven. It's actually in my top 25 Tan books we publish. And there it does emphasize that the holier you are here on earth, the more glorified your body will be in heaven.
Yeah.
And so it's almost like the more you deny your body here, the more glorified it will be later.
Yeah.
And so did he have a sense of the beauty of the body? Do you think Anselm had a sense of you can have even a more glorified body or less glorified body once you're in heaven?
He talks about that later on, and he says that, there will be differences in the souls of people, but it won't be differences in the sense of rivalry or whatsoever, because it will all be in perfect harmony with God. Yes, but this theme of the glorification or the perfection of the body, and this is something, where in our culture we're probably not that comfortable with, because there's a stereotypical idea of what a beautiful human being, whether it's a man or a woman, is supposed to look like. Yeah. But the fact is, everything which God created is intended to be beautiful.
Yeah.
And that includes human beings. Yeah. And while we're in this mortal condition where our bodies are impaired by sin, by the result of original sin and so forth, and in heaven we will be brought to perfection of being exactly what God intended us to do. And this is the highest possible beauty which any person can have. So yes, this idea that our bodies will achieve this perfect beauty. He working from the premise that beauty is something which all human hearts naturally desire, which we naturally aspire to.
Yeah, I think it's a very beautiful thing to keep in mind before we get to all these different attributes, because I've also heard that saints who have appeared to us from heaven have said, if I could go back and live a whole life of suffering just to improve my status in heaven just a little bit, I would do it, which isn't, there's no rivalry or anything. Everyone's kind of perfectly happy with, their state, but they know that they could have done more. They could have done more. Indeed. So I think we're just going to kind of go through this, and I'm going to name the attribute and let you kind of mention it, explain it.
I will. Yep.
So the next one is velocity. This is an interesting word. When I hear velocity, I think of like the velocity of baseball or something. The speed by which the glorified bodies can work through heaven.
Yeah, and this is interesting. And when I was translating it, the Latin word was velocitas, literally velocity. And I was thinking, is that really the right word in English? Because but I think it is. It is really the best one and the only one there. The idea that velocity, that freedom of movement is something which human beings naturally value and aspire to. And so if we love it now, if we want it now, we're going to have it to its full perfection in the kingdom of heaven. So this means that we'll be able to move around, as he says, just like the angels do, literally at the speed of thought. And he talks about the fastest thing which we can perceive here. And this, I think, is showing the keenness of his mind. He says the fastest thing is light. Right. That the rays of the sun reaching the human eye do it in like a split second, in almost a moment. But he says so much greater will be the velocity of the glorified bodies in heaven. That if these rays of light, which are inanimate things, can move so quickly, then our souls, which are intrinsically animate, which are animation themselves, will be able to move so much more quickly, which is a kind of astonishing idea, isn't it?
I mean, I just love the idea of, maybe it sounds almost fake to us, but it's not. I mean, to be able to zip across the universe and to see what the next galaxy looks like, and it's, because we think in terms of speed, and maybe this is a whole concept even above or beyond that, but we're just not limited to space and time, So just, you want to see the rest of the universe? There you go. You got it. And that's an amazing thing. I mean, if I was going to have that ability in life, I would do whatever was necessary to get that ability. But we're going to be able to have that ability. We just have to live a holy life now.
Indeed, Conor.
The immensity of strength, the next one, page 15.
So this is remarkable. So he talks about strength as being something which people naturally desire, which they naturally want. And if you think one of the worst conditions a human being could be in would be to be deprived of all their physical strength, So he says that this physical strength is going to reach its very perfection, that its very highest possible degree. And he talks about, like he says here, for those who attain the state of heaven and merit to be numbered amongst the citizens of the celestial Jerusalem, they shall possess such immense strength and power that nothing shall be able to prevent them from performing anything they wish. And there will be no force which is able to remove or overturn them from their state of eternal bliss in the love of God. And they will be able to employ the enormous strength which has been granted to them with no more effort than it currently takes us to blink our eyes.
It's incredible.
It is, indeed.
It's incredible. And the next attribute is fairly similar, the unimpaired freedom. And here, I'll read this. He says, we shall encounter no obstacle or restrictions whatsoever. There shall be no enclosure which is able to detain us. In a similar way, the body of the Lord after his resurrection could not be held by the tomb. After rising from the dead, he was able to pass through walls and closed door with perfect freedom. So kind of a similar idea of power is like we're going to be able to come and go as we please.
Indeed. And I think this removing of impairments to freedom is so important, because during this mortal life, whether we recognize it or not, there are so many things which impair our freedom. We're weighed down by a body, by distance, by physical obstacles. To think these things removed, we'll have this perfect freedom, which we never experience in this lifetime. But every human heart longs for freedom.
Yeah.
It's one of the fundamental values, I think.
Yeah, it's amazing. And the next one, the perfect well-being of the souls in heaven. And I think this basically means no pain.
Yeah.
We have no pain in our body. We have no illness. Is
Not
that right?
being subject to that, yeah. And when he talks about that, he says that in the present life, even when we think we're perfectly well, we're not really, because we're always very close to some injury. He says here's something very interesting. For those who believe themselves to be in completely perfect health, we can test this if it's really true. Take any apparently healthy and sound human body whose possessor considers themselves to be in a particular condition of perfect well-being. Now, if you apply pressure to any part of the body or strike it with any degree of force, immediately the person will exclaim, "Stop that, you're hurting me." So it shows this fragility, the fact that we're kind of entrapped in these mortal, flawed bodies all the time, that we never actually experience perfect well-being while we're in this life.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I think we often know that the greatest pleasure is the absence of pain.
It is. And you experience that after you've been suffering from some pain and it's taken away, and you think, wow, this is amazing.
I think we're going to have some kind of experience like that. We have, I'm not sitting here in pain right now, but the limitations and the fragility of the human body. Just once we get to heaven and we're freed from that, that's going to be glorious just in and of itself.
It will be.
So the opposite of pain is pleasure. And so the next one, he says, the pleasures of heaven. And he says, we call pleasure all those things which cause delight to the physical senses. And he talks about the sense of smell and sight and vision. So what is the pleasure of heaven like?
Yeah, so he talks about this as being an infinite pleasure, a pleasure which will continue to satisfy. And he points out very astutely that any earthly pleasure is only a pleasure for a certain period of time, and after a while starts to cause tedium, and then wears away, and
eventually boredom. Because you often think if you're gonna, do you get bored in heaven? And the answer is clearly no.
No, you don't. And to think also that this pleasure is something which is going to involve all of our senses. So it's not like sensory deprivation, but rather it's complete sensory fulfillment. So the best possible sensory experiences we could have in this earth will be multiplied to an infinite degree in heaven, and then enjoyed for an infinite period of time.
He's talking about the difference. He's saying, how do I explain what pleasure is like in heaven? So he kind of says, okay, let's talk about a little bit of pain. He doesn't go dark in this in any way. He's not talking about hell much at all. But he says, I'm going to read a little passage here. He says, I do not see how I can try to explain this except perhaps through a similitude based on the opposite phenomenon. I'm on page 23. Yeah. That is pain. Imagine this. He's got a vivid imagination. Imagine in your mind a human being, and then imagine that burning red hot irons are applied to the pupils of his eyes and to his other members. Think of the great pain he will experience, how agony shall suffice his whole body, so that neither the marrow of his bones, nor his intestines, nor any part of him shall be free from the most extreme discomfort. How could we describe the condition of such a person? He is thoroughly tormented, and he will be completely filled with agony and utterly overcome with anguish. In a similar but opposite way, and this was his whole point, in the future life of heaven, ineffable pleasure shall completely inebriate and saturate those who are saved. An unimaginable outflowing of delight shall fill them in all their senses with the most indescribable sweetness. And he talks about their eyes, their ears, their nostrils, their hands, their feet, their throat, their heart, their loins, their lungs, their bones. It's a beautiful concept, like incredible pleasure permeating every pore of our being.
Indeed. Yes, it is amazing. And, to think about that, he presents an example of pain, because I think we could probably more easily imagine the extremity of pain than we can the extremity of pleasure.
Exactly. In fact, you might even say, I wonder, Father, I mean, I bet you we spend more of our time fleeing pain than we do seeking pleasure.
Well, I think we do. I think we do. And so many things which we call pleasures in this life are really only the alleviation of pain.
Absolutely. Well, it's a deep insight. It's really good. The next section, the immortality of the life of heaven, which might sound a little obvious, but what does he mean by this?
Yeah, so he uses immortality in the sense that our life on earth is limited because it has a final point, whereas the immortality of the life in heaven, that it will go on and on forever. He says that every human being naturally desires length of life, that we consider length of life to be a blessing. Well, we will have this in heaven, not just a very long life, but an infinitely long life. So this is the immortality. And interestingly, in this book, he doesn't talk so much about eternity as in the sense of beyond time, but rather speaks about as a infinite duration of time, which is a different way of imagining it, I suppose.
Yeah, it is very good. The next thing is wisdom. Now, I particularly enjoyed this one because there's a lot I wish I had answers to, you know, and which one is more attractive to me? To be able to fly around the universe super fast, like the high velocity, and pick up a building, move mountains with incredible strength, or is it to understand the depths of the mysteries of our faith and of the universe and of human nature? I mean, like I'm a wannabe philosopher, right? And I just want to understand certain things. And so when I read about wisdom, he says, but in the next life, the blessed souls in heaven shall possess wisdom, which is of such a wonderful extent that there shall be absolutely nothing which they do not know or understand. I mean, so far in the book, that's the one that gives me the most excitement, is the wisdom.
So this desire for knowledge, this desire for wisdom is a universal human desire. And it's going to be fulfilled completely in heaven. And St. Anselm talks about this wonderfully. And he also talks about some very interesting philosophical questions which emerge from that. You know,
like our sin.
Will everyone know everyone else's sins? And he says, yes, they will. But it won't actually be a horrendous or an embarrassing thing, because the awareness of sin will be accompanied by the awareness of mercy and forgiveness. So.
Yeah, he mentions that we can better appreciate God's mercy if we have awareness of sin. And so it's converted, from this, it's converted from an emphasis on sin and embarrassment, which we have now, to an emphasis on, wow, look at all these sins, and therefore look how awesome God's mercy is.
Yes. I think that's right.
It's a real beautiful spin on that, and I enjoy that. It kind of takes the embarrassing factor off a little bit, because the point is not about us; it's about God.
Exactly.
The next thing, and this too, like this one got me really excited. The wonderful friendships amongst the souls in heaven. Now, I teach Aristotle, and I'm kind of very keen on the idea of what Aristotle refers to as true or virtuous friendship. And in that, you have to have two people who are really dedicated to each other to try to bring about the good in the other, right? So it can't be one way. And it's not true friendship if they're just hanging out together to have a good time, or if they're just useful to each other. Aristotle has 3 types of friendship: utility friendship, pleasure friendship, and then true or virtuous friendship. And so here I kind of see him describing, of course, true or virtuous friendship. He says, you will love your heavenly companions just as they will all love you. But here's the point I'm trying to get to. In this life, Father, we're limited to only a couple true friends, because it takes time to have those friendships. Aristotle says you can't have a dozen of these things. You just don't have time in the day. No. You can only have a couple throughout your life. And if you have a couple throughout your life, you're blessed. Aristotle says that. So, but in here, we can have innumerable friendships. Right. And most people, if they've experienced a true friendship, I guess often you can kind of say that might be found in marriage, in a way. But, even marriage is different because it's sacramental, but if you have a true friendship, you can look throughout history, or maybe people you've known. When a guy has a true friend, he will give up his wealth for that friend. He'll give up his reputation for that friend. Like, he'll sacrifice anything for that friend, but you only get to have a couple of them.
Yeah.
But in heaven, you get to have perhaps thousands, I guess, millions. I don't know.
That's right.
That's amazing.
And I think this is related to the perfect wisdom and perfect understanding, that we'll know all the other souls there perfectly and understand them perfectly, and be united in this one supreme love of God. And so there'll no longer be any place for the things which separate human beings from each other, which is the fact that they don't understand each other or don't know each other, the fact that they're rivals, the fact that they have different values and are seeking different things, because they will be united in the kingdom of heaven. So there'll be not only the happiness which one experiences oneself, but the happiness which comes from these other souls whom one will love, also partaking in this same eternal joy.
Which is the perfect segue to the next point. I mean, there's such a logical progression for Anselm here. I mean,
it is. So
these are connected.
His background as a philosopher and a theologian
is helping him. Yeah, I mean, it's not a coincidence that we went from friendship to now the next one on page 34 is concord. Where we don't have, how much of our life is made up of conflict and disagreement and argument, and and I mean, I probably have a propensity towards arguments, but the idea of heaven, there's no more argument. That seems like huge stress relief. Like, I don't have to argue anymore. So talk about what he means by concord.
Yeah. So concord is perfect harmony of will, and this perfect harmony of will comes about through the perfect union of the will of God. Now, in this life, of course, as you mentioned, there's a lot of conflict. It's not that every human soul fundamentally desires what's good, but we all understand what is good in a little different way, and the best way to achieve it, and so forth. So here, because that obstacle will be removed, there'll be this perfect concord. And when you do experience perfect harmony with another people or group of people, it's a tremendous feeling. It's quite rare, but when it does happen, and it will be the prevailing state in the kingdom of heaven.
I just like that in my house for a little bit, just no arguments in the house.
Okay, yes. I think the closest we get to it in this life is when everyone is asleep.
That's true. Yeah, definitely. That's true at my house. The next one's power. Power. Okay. You can't have a talk about heaven very long until you start talking about power.
Yeah. Now, this is very interesting, and this brings about a point that since our will be in perfect harmony with the will of God, whatever we wish for, God will also wish for. They say whatever God wishes for, we will also wish for, which means that in effect, we will find ourselves omnipotent, possessing all power. Whatever we will be done.
I really will be able, if I make it, to move mountains.
You will.
Yeah.
Because the mountains you want to move will be the same as the mountains God wants to move.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's awesome. Yeah, that's great.
Yeah.
Now, I love the next one on honor. Now, he begins this one with a great story, about the beggar and king.
Yes.
Do you remember that?
Yep.
Can you tell us that story?
Okay. So if we imagine there's this king and a beggar, a certain poor and wretched beggar from whom all solace is absent, and who is afflicted with hideous ulcers and other foul wounds and infirmities. Now imagine that a most powerful and magnificent king is passing by and happens to see this poor wretch lying in the dirt by the wayside. And the king feels pity for and compassion for the poor man, and commands that his wounds be treated and healed, and that the beggar should be clothed in fine garments from his own stores. And he also goes on to adopt this wretched beggar as his very own son, and henceforth commands that all the subjects of his kingdom are to regard him as his own adopted son, and so that no one is to belittle him or disparage him upon him any way. Now, think about the great honor which this beggar has received in being clothed by this magnificent king and adopted as his own son. Now, that's what's happened to every single human soul. We were in this state of wretched dejection, and God himself, the King of the universe, has singularly chosen each one of us and clothed us with his honor, and commanded that we be his adopted sons or daughters. So yeah, it's an awesome thing to think we will have that honor of being an adopted son of not just any king, but of the supreme king.
I find it interesting. That's how Anselm decided to explain honor.
Yeah.
Is by showing this honor, which we don't deserve, being bestowed on us by somebody way above us. And that's why he tells that little parable.
Yeah, that we will have the dignity of true sons and daughters of God.
On page 42, absolute security. Another interesting thing about heaven. You know, I don't really think about that, but we live a whole lot of our lives without security.
We do. And this, of course, varies. Sometimes we can be in a state of acute insecurity where we're not sure of our status in the world, of our, future prosperity, our future survival even. But even when we feel relatively secure in this world, we're only relatively secure, not absolutely secure, because so much could happen. Yeah. The unexpected could happen. But this will be completely removed in heaven.
Yeah.
So we will then have absolute security, realizing that everything we possess eternally, that nothing can be taken away from us.
The final attribute that he gives is perfect joy. And, that's interesting to me because joy and happiness. I always kind of get confused on what the difference is between joy and happiness, but there's something very exciting about joy. So, do you recall anything about this, about what perfect joy in heaven is like? It's almost, to me, it's almost like a summary of everything we just read come together.
It is. And he emphasizes also that this perfect joy is going to be multiplied by the fact that all the other souls whom we will all love and be in perfect harmony with will also be seeing this joy. So he says, if you have a perfect friendship and one of your friends has wonderful joy, you're also filled with joy. Yeah. Now, this is going to be multiplied to a huge, extrapolated to a huge extent because of the very multitude of the souls in heaven. So the joy of everyone else will multiply one's own. If I could just read a little bit from here. He says, there shall be 1,000 times 1,000 souls who enjoy the perfection of happiness, or rather 1,000 times 100,000, or rather a number which is utterly incomprehensible and uncountable. And applying the principle we have just described, each one shall have their own joys multiplied in perceiving the joys of all the others.
Yeah. Well, that's great. It gives me some hope that there's a good number of people there. So, on page, I'm going to skip ahead a little bit for the sake of time. And on page 53, he finally gets to, he's been describing heaven and our glorified bodies, but then he gets to, okay, so in order to get to heaven, you have to have a certain attribute. You
do.
And this little section is entitled On the Necessity of Self-Knowledge, Confession, and Humility. And, in a previous podcast, you and I have talked about humility, and how important that is. And he has some interesting things to say here about humility, but my mind focused in on one. And it's where you had a footnote where on page 55, he says, he's talking about how some people back in his day, they had to kind of make public confessions in the monastery.
They did, yeah.
And he talks about what true humility is. Do you remember this?
Yeah.
Yeah. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Okay. So he says true humility comes about when you're prepared to accept your faults when other people identify them.
Yeah.
And I think there's a lot of truth to this, that, each of us, if we're asked, what's a fault you have, we can probably name one or two or several, and we're okay with that. But then if someone else tells us one of our faults, we're not so okay with that.
No, it's true.
So, we're okay to say, I'm a bit slack about this or whatever. If someone else says you're a bit slack about this, then we get upset.
Yeah.
And, I think that's what he's saying is true humility is to be able to receive calmly and honestly other people finding our faults. If you think about it, it's other people really who are best qualified to tell us what our own faults are, and often if we say, what are your own faults, people will say something like, I'm too much of a perfectionist, or I work too hard, or
They do. They do.
But
whenever I interview people who want a job here, I'll say, okay, what are your faults? And they say, I just really work too hard. I'm like, come on, get out of here. Give me something real, man.
Yeah. So I think this openness to having to listening to the criticism of others, and if you think about it, the criticism of others is always true, because if someone says, you're impatient, we say, no, I'm not impatient. Well, I mean, it's the way you treat others, the way you come across, which really. So I think this openness is real humility.
And they might have had a practice back in the old days in monasteries where you stood up and kind of confessed your sins.
So there is a practice which I'm not sure if any monasteries still do this, but there used to be what was called a chapter of faults, where each week you would go and say whatever your faults were, whatever you'd done wrong. And then the community would also add to that, oh, yes, and you've also done this wrong and this wrong. So I think probably it's wise that we don't have that anymore. I know in our community, and probably in most communities, it would be a formula for
disaster.
Yeah,
I guess the times have changed. At the end of this book, there's another part to this, and it's called an exhortation to strive for the glories of heaven, and it's on page 74. And I just love how he starts it. He says, "My friend, what is it that you're doing?" I mean, I kind of hear him almost yelling at me. Why is it that like a beast you immerse yourself so enthusiastically and avidly in the vain and ephemeral things of this passing world? And then he kind of lectures to us about how we got to get serious. You got to. Yeah. As I read this, I felt a kick in the butt by my spiritual director, Saint Anselm. He was so this is a very powerful couple pages where he's talking directly to us very assertively, saying to restrain yourself from all earthly things, emulate the angels, and strive to make all your thoughts and desires chaste and holy. Free your soul from the chains which bind it to the passing vanities of the material realm. I mean, it's so strong. It's very, very strong, and it's almost encouraging. I kind of feel like a coach or something on the sideline is yelling at you, encouraging you, motivating you to play harder. That's what I experienced with this.
Oh yes. This is such a powerful discourse, and it uses some of the language which we don't hear so much these days. The vanities of this passing world and so forth. But there is this great wisdom and encouragement in this exhortation. What are we doing? Our time here is limited. That we're destined for somewhere else. We're just passing through here. We're letting ourselves, it's a bit like a person on a journey, stopping too long to look at the scenery around them and getting too involved with what's going on while they're on the journey.
Yeah, you got to get somewhere.
The destination.
Yeah. And the very last, I thought I would just read a little bit of the very last paragraph, second to last paragraph of the book. And he does something, Father, that I've never really done. He just does it in a slightly different way than I've ever considered it. He says, act and think now as if you are dead to the world, and let the world be dead to you. Look at the glories of this passing sphere as if you are already amongst the dead and had left all mortal cares and aspirations far behind. Imagine that you're already resting in your tomb, and that the wealth, honor, and pleasure of this terrestrial orb mean nothing to you. Do not allow your heart to be infatuated with anything from which you are destined to be separated, either sooner or later. For whatever you are not able to possess eternally, you never truly possess at all. And in the very last paragraph, do nothing for the sake of obtaining merely human praise or popular acclaim or public fame, for such things involve much effort and anxiety, but they are really nothing at all. Instead, do everything for the sake of the eternal life and the everlasting unbound happiness of heaven, which, if you but act justly, love tenderly, and believe sincerely Christ in his infinite mercy and love, shall most assuredly bestow upon you, who, with the Father and the Holy Spirit, lives and reigns forever and ever. Amen. This is a powerful way to close this remarkable book. The reason that St. Anselm, Father, in my opinion, is such a great spiritual master, a spiritual director for us, is because here he is, like he's imploring us, how many 1,000 years later, almost, he's imploring us to strive for heaven hard, and to work at it hard. And this, I love this volume because he's showing us how glorious our bodies will be in heaven. But we have to begin now by detaching ourselves from our bodies, from the devil's temptation and from the world.
Yeah, indeed. And this detachment doesn't imply that, that we don't do anything while we're here. We continue to do our duties, to live the Christian life, to fulfill the gospel, to serve God and to serve our fellow men. But we do it all as pilgrims passing through a strange land. We have no lasting dwelling here. That everything which is here today will be gone tomorrow, including ourselves. But this eternity which awaits us is so immense, so important, that it should be our number one priority at all times.
In closing, I'll just say that, the reason that I think this is such an important book for traditional Catholics is, we have a tendency sometimes, Father, to overemphasize purgatory and hell and the devil. And, traditional Catholics, we love the stories of exorcisms. I mean, we enjoy those things to some extent because it's interesting. But as you mentioned earlier, there's not a lot of books written about heaven. There's more books written about hell.
There are.
And it's important for us Catholics to dwell on heaven, seeing the prize that awaits us, and not to become overly morbid by focusing too much on the negative things. And so I feel that this is very edifying. This is very uplifting. It's very motivational. And in fact, in my personal life, Father, I find thinking about what the glorified body can be as more motivational than just avoiding the pains of hell.
Yeah. And I think that's absolutely right. We should give priority to meditating upon the joys of heaven rather than fear of hell. And of course, hell is greatly to be feared, but our God is a God who wants to reward us, who wants us to attain heaven. And that's what we're created for. Yeah. So this is what our souls are made for. So we should spend time meditating upon heaven. Of course, we can never do it perfectly, as Anselm himself notes. But whatever we do is a step in the right direction and a motivation of reminding us why we're living the Christian life. Yeah.
So St. Anselm is a spiritual master because he's someone, not just because he's a great writer or a great theologian, but because we should emulate him. So, what are some of his personal virtues or charisms that you know about that you think we should focus on and try to emulate in our lives?
Hey guys, real quick, I know you're enjoying this podcast, but there's somebody else out there that might really need it as well. So please take a second and think, family, friends, who is it that needs this particular content today? Take a second and send it to them. It's a great work of evangelization. Now back to the episode.
Well, St. Anselm was, he proved himself to be a wonderfully versatile person, to be open to whatever God and the Church was calling him to do at any given time. He began his religious life, by entering a monastery and was aspiring to have a quiet monastic life, but soon found himself called to positions of leadership, firstly of his own monastery, and then of the entire English Church as Archbishop of Canterbury. He found himself then travelling back and forth from Europe, conducting important business, trying to negotiate for the freedom of the Church, for the stability of his own country, England, and so forth. So we see someone who is prepared to respond to the calling of the time, in whatever way it might be, almost blindly to follow wherever God is leading him, and to remain faithful in that, and to take everything on board perfectly calmly.
What I hear you saying is that Anselm was somebody who was pushed and pulled by God's divine providence, and he accepted it calmly and
he
peacefully.
Accepted it calmly, yeah. And what's more, he applied all of his God-given talents to the work which he was doing. So he was talented as a scholar, as a pastor, as a speaker, as a writer, and he applied all of these gifts to the glory of God and to the service of the church, which I think each of us is called upon to do, to think, what has God given me and how can I use this for the service of God and his church?
If you had to pick one of his many works that was your favorite, maybe the favorite to read, maybe favorite to meditate on, maybe your favorite to translate, I don't know, but what would you say is one of your favorites?
Well, I guess one of my very favorites is the Proslogion. And this goes back to my days as a theology student. And I think it would be fair to say it was the first work which I read in Latin completely for the purpose of writing an essay on. So, so it was something I particularly loved. But since that time, I've read his works more broadly. And I have to say some of his devotional works, which are not so well known, have impressed me. Especially he wrote a wonderful collection of Marian hymns and poems. And wrote also a few lives of different saints, which are quite amazing. Very curious medieval miracles and so forth, which type of things you don't hear about so often these days, but works which I absolutely love.
How would you recommend that somebody kind of get in touch with Saint Anselm? I would not say go read about the Ontological Argument.
No.
We might have two right here.
What I would recommend is the Glories of Heaven is a very good place to start with Saint Anselm, because it is very encouraging, uplifting, and at the same time, it's a very logically thought out work. So he mixes this mysticism with human reasoning, working out the various attributes of the glorified bodies and souls of heaven. So, it's quite a short work, but very powerful. As
we talked about in the last episode, I think it's the perfect place to get people started with Anselm. It might be the perfect place to get people started with any spiritual life.
Well, it is, and I have to say the presentation of this book that Ted has put together really suits the subject. So,
thanks.
It's absolutely beautiful.
Yeah, it's beautiful and it's small. It's not intimidating. The language is eloquent, but not. It's not complicated. It's very beautiful, but it's not overly simplistic. It's really, really well translated and nicely designed. But it all started with Anselm. But I think the reason that it's a great primer for anybody in the spiritual life is because it starts with the end in mind. Like, this is why we're doing everything. The stuff that it says in this little book is why Aquinas wrote the Summa Theologica. It's why, Jesuit martyrs go out into the jungles and try to convert the native people. It's why Peter got crucified upside down. Yeah. It's why all the apostles, except for John, got martyred, and John got dipped in boiling oil. So it's why it's why we do what we do, and so there's not many works out there that highlight the whole purpose of everything that we're trying to do. Indeed. And I feel like this does it wonderfully.
It does indeed, and to keep our hearts fixed on that final goal. I think so often in our religious life we can be distracted by the lesser goals, by the passing goals, by church practice, tradition, liturgy, and so forth, by moral teaching and so forth. But the ultimate goal, which puts it all in context, is this desire for heaven, and this puts it, reminds us of the importance of everything else, puts everything else in its proper perspective.
I got a sense that if Anselm was alive today, he'd be tremendously successful, in whatever he did. I don't know if he'd be, a cardinal or a great theologian or just a humble pastor, but I got the sense if he was walking around today, you and I would say, but that is like one of the most amazing people we've ever met. I think as a human, he was just probably extremely impressive, even though humble and probably understated.
Yes, indeed. And we read in his biography about how he would keep very late hours to complete this work. And you think of all the things he did in his life, and it's almost as if he was more than one person to be able to achieve this. And it was all underpinned by his Benedictine monasticism, by his commitment to regularity of life, to prayer, to enclosure, and so much forth, as much as he possibly could in the midst of his very demanding career.
Perhaps our conversation has revealed that Anselm is a guy we can the stay-at-home mom, the busy executive, the blue-collar worker, whoever it is in whatever state of life, they can appeal to St. Anselm and his intercession to embrace the station of your life and to accept God's will for you in whatever way that is, whatever God's put in front of you. Ask St. Anselm's assistance to embrace that peacefully and calmly and joyfully. Is that a fair statement?
I think very much so, Conor. You've put it very well.
Well, I pray that our customers do that. I think they can come to tanbooks.com and check out some of these incredible works that you've translated. And I hope we can do a lot more with St. Anselm. And I think it's my job to kind of be an evangelist of these spiritual masters. And St. Anselm's got a special place in my heart. And I think it's really because of the Glories of Heaven book. I mean, that was a very special thing. I mean, The Passion of Christ Through the Eyes of Mary, very fun to read, very powerful. I love it. I love it. I love it. But the most motivating thing for me to change my daily life is focusing on the end goal and seeing what God made Conor to be is explained very well in this little book. So with that, I thank you very much, Father, for your translation work, for being here with us today and explaining St. Anselm for us.
Hey, thanks guys for checking out the Conor Gallagher Show. Please take a moment to like, subscribe, or comment, or whatever you got to do to support it. And I appreciate that very much.